Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to try to take a look at a conservative vision for U.S. foreign policy.
Okay.
Should be pretty interesting. We're going to be using a chapter from the book Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise as our source material.
Right.
And as you might imagine, this book basically lays out how a future conservative president might completely revamp a lot of things about how the U.S. government works.
Exactly.
So this particular chapter that we're looking at is focused on the State Department,
Right.
which is, the part of the U.S. government that handles diplomacy and relations with other countries,
Yeah, all that.
all that. So, yeah, this should be pretty interesting. What really jumped out at me when I first started looking at this was that they call the State Department a crippled institution.
Yeah, right off the bat, they don't pull any punches.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious, like, what's the thinking behind that? Why do they view the State Department in such a negative light?
Well, the main argument they make is that the State Department has become this huge, sprawling bureaucracy. I think they said like 80,000 employees in something like 275 locations all over the world.
Well, that's a lot.
And they claim that because of that, it's become kind of disconnected from the elected president, and especially a conservative president.
So they're saying that the State Department's almost like acting on its own.
Yeah, kind of. They argue that it sees itself as sort of this independent entity that gets to set its own foreign policy agenda, even if that clashes with what the president wants.
Well, so imagine you're this new conservative president, you come into office, and you've got this huge State Department that's maybe not exactly on board with your vision.
Right.
What do you do?
Well, they have a pretty radical solution for that. They say that on day one, the new president should immediately replace every single ambassador.
Well, hold on. Every ambassador.
Yeah. Both the political appointees and the career diplomats, especially the ones in countries they see as strategically important, or where they think the ambassador might not be aligned with them.
So it's like a total reset on U.S. diplomacy.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold move for sure.
And then it doesn't even stop there. They say that the president should immediately freeze all State Department activities.
Everything, treaties, funding, contracts, everything goes on hold until it's been reviewed, and they've determined whether it actually aligns with the new administration's policies.
It's like hitting the pause button on U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, and they even go so far as to say that they should suspend enforcement of any treaties that weren't ratified by the Senate.
Wow. So we've got this crippled institution that needs a major leadership shakeup.
Yeah.
And you're hitting pause on everything it does. Where do we go from there? What's the overall plan for how the U.S. should engage with the world?
So the chapter lays out a plan that focuses on what they consider the 5 biggest challenges facing the U.S. They single out 5 specific countries: China, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and North Korea.
Okay, so those are the countries that need the most attention. Let's start with China, because they're pretty clear about how they see China. They call it an existential threat.
Right, and they don't just mean an economic or military threat. They see China's rise and its authoritarian system as a fundamental challenge to the American way of life, to democracy itself.
So how do you even begin to deal with something like that?
Well, they propose developing something they call an Article X for China.
Article X.
It's kind of a reference to George Kennan and his famous long telegram from back in the Cold War. He basically laid out a strategy for containing the Soviet Union.
Oh, I see. So this Article X would be like a modern-day version of that.
Exactly. It would be a comprehensive strategy document outlining how to counter China's influence on every level: economic, military, diplomatic, you name it.
So it's a grand strategy for the 21st century.
Yeah.
But what would that actually look like in practice? How would you actually counter China's influence?
They focus a lot on making Chinese aggression unaffordable. They argue that you need to raise the cost of any aggressive actions China takes so high that they simply can't afford to do it.
So things like sanctions, military deployments.
Exactly. It's about deterrence, but it's also about competition pushing back on China's influence in every arena.
Okay, China's a big one for sure. But what about Iran? They seem to be pretty critical of how previous administrations have handled Iran.
Yeah, they argued that both the Obama and Biden administrations were way too soft on Iran and that they basically emboldened the regime.
So they're saying things like the nuclear deal actually made things worse.
Yeah, they argue that giving Iran economic lifelines like that just strengthened their grip on power and allowed them to continue doing things like sponsoring terrorism and violating human rights.
And they see the current protests in Iran as a sign that the regime might be vulnerable.
Exactly. They think this could be a real opportunity for change.
So what's their alternative? What do they think the U.S. should be doing?
They advocate for a much tougher stance. They want to see the U.S. support the Iranian people's desire for democracy and push back forcefully against the regimes.
So tougher sanctions.
Right.
Maybe even military action.
They don't rule anything out. They say that could include tougher sanctions, military support for regional allies, and even covert actions to destabilize a regime.
Wow, that's a pretty hawkish stance.
It is. They're definitely not afraid to use hard power.
Okay, so we've got a hard line on China pushing for regime change in Iran. And they're just getting started, right?
Right. Next up is Venezuela, which they see as another example of a failed socialist regime that's become a problem for the U.S.
Yeah, it's right in America's backyard, so it makes sense that they would be concerned about it.
Exactly. And they're worried about Venezuela's ties to both China and Iran and the refugee crisis that it's created.
So what do they propose doing about it?
They call for a united hemispheric approach to contain Venezuela and aid the Venezuelan people.
Basically stopping the spread of what they see as dangerous ideologies in America's backyard. And what about Russia? How do they fit into this picture?
That's a bit more complicated. They acknowledge that there's no easy answer on Russia, even among conservatives.
Yeah, we've seen that debate playing out over how much to support Ukraine.
Exactly. Some conservatives want to see continued strong support for Ukraine. Others favor pulling back. And still others propose a kind of middle ground of limited involvement.
So even within this conservative framework, there's no clear consensus on Russia.
Not really, but what's interesting is that they frame the Russia question in the context of China.
What do you mean?
They argue that ultimately China is the defining threat of this century, and that might mean we need to recalibrate our priorities even when it comes to Russia.
So maybe even pull back from some commitments in Europe to focus on the China challenge.
Exactly. It's a real dilemma.
Okay, so we've got China, Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. That leaves North Korea. What's their take on that situation?
They're pretty clear on this one. They say that North Korea absolutely cannot be allowed to become a nuclear power.
So no tolerance for North Korea's nuclear ambitions?
None whatsoever. They want to see a firm stance to deter North Korean threats against U.S. allies and to basically prevent them from acting like a rogue regime.
It sounds like this blueprint for U.S. foreign policy is all about drawing hard lines in the sand and taking a much more assertive stance on the world stage.
Absolutely. It's a big departure from what we've seen in recent years, and we've only just scratched the surface here. There's a lot more to unpack in this chapter, especially when it comes to specific regions and policy areas.
And that's where we're headed next. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into this conservative vision for reshaping U.S. foreign policy.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting about this chapter is how they kind of break down their recommendations by region.
Oh, yeah.
It really gives you a sense of their worldview and how they see U.S. interests playing out globally.
Yeah, it's like they're taking us on a guided tour of the world through this conservative lens.
Exactly.
And it's clear that they prioritize certain regions over others, like they spend a lot of time talking about the Western Hemisphere, for example.
Yeah, it's America's backyard, so it makes sense that they would focus on that. They argue that it's vital to U.S. security and prosperity.
Right. And their top priority there is creating what they call a sovereign Mexico. They basically argue that Mexico's lost control to the cartels.
Yeah, and that directly threatens the U.S. They paint a pretty grim picture of what could happen if the chaos and violence spills over the border.
So what can the U.S. actually do about it?
They don't get into a lot of specifics, but they stress the need to help Mexico restore order. And their top priority is tackling the fentanyl crisis.
Yeah, that's a huge issue.
Yeah.
But is it really something the U.S. can influence?
Well, that's the question, right? Can the U.S. actually help Mexico get a handle on the cartels and the drug trafficking?
Right.
It's a tough one. But they also have this really interesting idea of re-hemisphering manufacturing and industry.
Re-hemisphering, what does that even mean?
Basically encouraging U.S. companies to move their operations from China and other distant locations to Central and South America.
Oh, so like bringing jobs back to the Americas.
Exactly. They argue that it would benefit both the U.S. and its neighbors.
Yeah, I can see how that would appeal to them. Stronger economies in Central and South America, less reliance on China, potentially fewer migrants trying to reach the U.S.
Right. It's a pretty bold vision.
It is. But how realistic is it? I mean, think about all the existing trade agreements and the global supply chains.
Yeah, it would require a massive shift in how things work now.
For sure.
Okay.
But it definitely fits with their overall goal of strengthening the Western Hemisphere, making it more stable and prosperous.
Exactly.
But what about the security side of things? There are still a lot of threats in the region.
Right. And that's where they talk about taking a more local approach to security.
What do you mean by that?
Basically, working closely with democratic allies in the region, like Colombia and Brazil, to counter the influence of China, Iran, and Russia.
So kind of like empowering regional partners to take on more responsibility.
Exactly. They see it as a way to address security threats closer to home and reduce the need for direct U.S. intervention.
So it's kind of a train-the-trainer approach to security.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
We saw a similar idea in their discussion of Europe. But let's stick with this regional tour for a minute. What about the Middle East and North Africa? That's always a volatile region.
It is. And their approach there is definitely influenced by their hawkish stance on Iran.
Right. They want to see regime change in Iran.
Exactly. So in the Middle East, their strategy focuses on containing Iran.
And how do they propose doing that?
Well, they talk about using a combination of sanctions, military assistance to allies like Israel, and even potential support for internal opposition groups.
So they're really not messing around.
Nope. They see Iran as a serious threat.
But wouldn't that risk further destabilizing the region? I mean, it's already pretty volatile.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Critics would definitely argue that it could backfire and lead to more conflict and chaos.
But they're basically saying that the status quo is unacceptable.
Right. They believe that Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons and its support for terrorist groups is just too dangerous to ignore.
So they're willing to take a more aggressive approach, even if it's risky.
Exactly. They're basically saying that the consequences of inaction are even worse.
Okay, so they're playing hardball with Iran. But what about other aspects of the Middle East? Do they have any thoughts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example?
They don't really get into the specifics of that conflict, but they do emphasize the importance of building on the Abraham Accords.
Those were the agreements that normalized relations between Israel and some Arab states, right?
Yeah. So they're basically saying, let's focus on what's working and try to expand on that.
Makes sense. And they also call for creating a broader Middle East security pact.
Yeah, they envision a pact that would include Israel, Egypt, the Gulf states, and potentially even India.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It is. The idea is to create this network of like-minded countries to counter Iranian influence and promote regional stability.
It would definitely be a challenge to get all those countries on the same page.
No doubt. But it shows how they're thinking about the region.
Right. And speaking of key players, they seem to see India as a really important partner, not just in the Middle East, but globally.
Yeah, they highlight the U.S.-India relationship as a crucial counterbalance to China.
So India is a key piece of the puzzle for them.
Absolutely. And they also talk about the need for a revamped regional strategy to address challenges like a Taliban in Afghanistan and the U.S.-Pakistan relationship.
Yeah, those are some tough issues.
They are. And they acknowledge that there are no easy answers.
It sounds like they're advocating for a more nuanced and pragmatic approach in South Asia.
Yeah, recognizing that it's a region with a long history of conflict and instability.
So they've covered the Western Hemisphere, the Middle East, and South Asia.
What about other parts of the world?
Will they actually dedicate a whole section to sub-Saharan Africa?
Really? That's not a region that gets a lot of attention in U.S. foreign policy debates.
I know, but they argue that it's becoming increasingly important.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, they're concerned about China's growing influence in Africa.
Yeah. China's been investing heavily in Africa.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And they're particularly worried about China's control over key mineral resources. Those are the resources that are essential for modern technology, right?
Right. Things like cobalt and lithium.
So they don't want China to have a monopoly on those resources.
Exactly. But it's not just about resources. They're also concerned about China's model of development.
Which is?
State-led development.
Yeah.
They see that as a threat to free markets and democracy in Africa.
So they see it as a competition between two different systems.
Yeah. And they're worried that China's using its economic clout to gain political leverage and undermine U.S. interests.
Okay, so they see China as a major player in Africa. What do they propose doing about it?
Well, they talk about shifting U.S. aid away from general assistance and towards promoting free markets and private sector engagement.
So less handouts, more investments that promote sustainable growth.
That's the idea. They also emphasize the need to counter terrorism, build coalitions with cooperative African nations, and avoid imposing what they see as divisive U.S. social policies.
It sounds like they're trying to walk a fine line between promoting U.S. values and respecting African sovereignty.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They recognize that Africa is a complex and diverse continent with its own unique challenges and opportunities.
Okay, so we've talked about the Western Hemisphere, the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. What about Europe? How does the transatlantic relationship fit into their vision?
They definitely acknowledge the importance of the transatlantic relationship, but they also argue that Europe needs to step up and bear a fairer share of the burden when it comes to security.
So less reliance on the U.S. as a global policeman.
Exactly. They call for European nations to exceed the 2% GDP NATO commitment and take on more responsibility for their own defense.
But wouldn't pushing Europe to do more risk straining the relationship?
It's possible, but they argue that Europe has become too complacent, relying too heavily on the U.S. security umbrella.
And they also want to see some changes in trade relations.
Yeah, they suggest reviewing U.S.-EU trade deals to make sure they're fair and reciprocal.
So basically making sure that Europe isn't taking advantage of the U.S.
Right. And they also talk about the need to develop new alliances within the EU, particularly with Central European countries that are vulnerable to Russian influence.
So strengthening ties with those who share U.S. values and interests.
Exactly.
It sounds like they're trying to reshape the transatlantic relationship, make it more of a partnership of equals.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're not advocating for abandoning Europe, but they do want to see a more balanced relationship.
Okay, so they've covered a lot of ground here, from Mexico to the Middle East, from Africa to Europe. Are there any other regions on their radar?
You might be surprised to hear this, but they actually dedicate a whole section to the Arctic.
The Arctic. What's that got to do with U.S. foreign policy?
Well, they make a pretty compelling case for why it's becoming strategically important.
I'm all ears.
So basically, they argue that because of climate change, the Arctic is melting, and that's opening up new shipping routes and access to resources like oil and gas.
Oh, I see. So it's becoming a new frontier for competition.
Exactly. And they're worried that the U.S. is falling behind countries like Russia and China, who are already making moves in the region.
So what do they propose doing about it?
They call for a stronger U.S. presence in the Arctic, including expanding Navy and Coast Guard capabilities.
Some more ships, more icebreakers.
Exactly. They want the U.S. to be able to project power and protect its interests in this increasingly important region.
So they've taken us on this whirlwind tour of global hotspots, from Mexico to the Middle East, from Africa to the Arctic. It's a pretty comprehensive vision.
It is, and it really shows how they're thinking about the challenges and opportunities facing the U.S. in the 21st century.
But how do they actually propose making all this happen? I mean, we keep hearing about the State Department as this crippled institution.
Right?
So how do you go from that to a lean, mean foreign policy machine?
That's a great question. And that's where we get into the nitty-gritty details of their plan for reforming the State Department. And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've got this big picture view now of how they want to change America's approach to the world. They definitely want to be more assertive, stand up to those rivals, and put America's interests first. But it all comes down to the State Department, right? And we keep hearing how it's this huge, slow, crippled thing. So how do they get it to actually do all this?
Yeah, that's the big question. Can you actually make the State Department into that tool they need for this tougher foreign policy? They spend a lot of time on that, actually, how to make it more effective and way more in line with what a conservative president wants.
All right, let's get into it. What kind of changes are they talking about?
Big ones. A complete reorganization, for starters. Cut out all the stuff that overlaps. Make it clear who is accountable for what. The goal is to make the whole department leaner, faster, more responsive.
Sounds like a pretty massive bureaucratic shakeup.
Yeah.
But I guess if you think it's that broken, you got to do something drastic, right?
That's their thinking, yeah. And then they go after foreign aid, all those different programs.
Yeah.
Their idea is to put one person in charge of all of it, a single director who makes sure that aid always matches up with the president's foreign policy goals.
So no more money going to places that, aren't exactly friendly to the U.S.
It's the idea. And they don't stop that international organizations are next. They say America needs to be way more picky about which ones we support.
So like the UN, the World Health Organization,
Yeah.
those kinds of groups.
Exactly. They use Trump as an example, actually pulling out of the WHO, defunding that UN Human Rights Council. That's the kind of approach they want to see more of. Their argument is that a lot of these global organizations are just bloated and don't really help America, sometimes even work against us.
So America first, even when it comes to those global things, fits with the rest of what we've seen. Anything else that stands out in how they want to change things?
Public diplomacy is a big one. They basically say it's completely useless right now. No one's listening to America's message. Their solution: bring back all that international broadcasting. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. Use those to fight back against China and Russia's propaganda. Spread a pro-freedom message around the world.
Almost like going back to the Cold War, right? Back when it was America versus the Soviets, trying to win people over.
It is kind of like that. But they're not stuck in the past. They also say cyber diplomacy is huge EE now, and America needs to be much tougher in that space, especially against China and Russia.
It's a whole new battleground, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not just about armies and weapons anymore.
Right. It's about information, about who controls what people see and hear online, about cyber attacks, and they say the U.S. needs to step up big time.
Well, we've covered a ton in this deep dive. Started with that idea of the State Department as a crippled institution that needs complete makeover. Then we went around the world, saw how they want to be much tougher on places like China, Iran, and now we've seen their plans to actually change how the State Department works, make it able to do all of that.
It's a really ambitious vision, got to give them that, and probably one that a lot of people are going to disagree with.
No kidding. So, for those of you listening,
Yeah.
why should you care about all this? Even if you don't like the sound of it, what's the takeaway here?
I think this shows us one possible future for American foreign policy, a future where America is less worried about, being the good guy all the time, more about taking care of its interests and not playing by the rules of a global system it thinks is rigged against it. Whether you like that or think it's dangerous, it's important to understand the ideas behind it, because these ideas could really change things on the world stage.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. Is it even possible to do what they want? What would happen to America, to the world, if we did? A lot of questions there.
For sure. And anyone who wants to learn more, really get into the details of all this, you got to check out this chapter, the whole book. Actually mandate for leadership. Whether you agree with it or not, it makes you think.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. We took a look at this conservative blueprint for U.S. foreign policy, something that's definitely going to stir things up. Thanks for joining us. Keep those questions coming, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.